Hey guys, welcome to Breakshift's Tempest card tier list. We're going to be going through all the Tempest cards in the game and tiering them according to the following system. S tier is going to be for cards that are more or less auto-includes and will pretty much always be very effective. A tier is going to be for win conditions, cards that form the offensive or defensive backbone of your deck. B tier is going to be for role-playing cards, cards that don't particularly excel in any one area but fulfill an important role in your deck, such as blocking or drawing cards. And lastly, C tier is going to be for generally mediocre cards that usually aren't worth considering. We're all going to be ranking these cards with respect to their rarity, because rarity does generally correlate to power level in Vault. And just like with the hidden tier list, we're not going to be putting cards onto like an actual physical tier list, because there's 97 total Tempest cards, which I think would be way too many to visually parse. Instead, we'll just pull the cards up one at a time and put the tier that they correspond to on the screen while we talk about them. So let's get started here. First off, we have Armored Approach. This is a solid B tier card. It is a fairly flexible defensive option, as is generally going to be the case with rebound cards. The ability to either play them twice, play them once and then purge the rebounded copy, or play it once and hold the rebounded copy for the next turn means that it's almost always going to be useful if you have threat on the stack, whether it's a lot or a little. This one, since it does make the next card cost one more, it's not as good as other rebound cards in that aspect, because it becomes more expensive to play it twice, whereas something like a Surefoot that you've upgraded doesn't have that issue. But you know, it's not terrible by any stretch. Just a decent blocker. Next we have a Weighted Assault. A Weighted Assault is more than a decent blocker. It is an A tier card. So what's really nice about a Weighted Assault, it does have some degree of flexibility with the block value, right? You can manipulate it by spending energy on your turn, so that it's not like wasting too much block if you want to do other things first. It can block for decently high amounts in the late game if you got like a bunch of overcharge and stuff, and pretty much at all points throughout the game. That delay rage 50% is really juicy. That's gonna significantly increase your damage next turn, and if you upgrade it so that you get overcharge 1 as well, it's gonna make you more able to effectively use that rage because you're gonna have more energy. It's really good, even if you're not getting any block out of it at all. Just playing it for 1 energy to get that delay rage and maybe overcharge is often a pretty good deal. Very solid A tier card. Next we've got a starter card, Batter. Batter is a B tier. It is very just okay. 6 damage isn't all that much, but 25% rage is pretty good. If you upgrade it, you get a whopping 50% rage. That's actually quite nice. It's not that uncommon in my Tempest runs that I'll upgrade 1 batter and put a redstone in it, so I can get a nice 75% rage for 1 energy, and a little bit of chip damage too. That's pretty decent. But that is a decent amount of investment, so not the most powerful option, but it definitely has its place. Worth a B tier in my consideration. Next we have Clashing Steel. Clashing Steel is kind of interesting in that it's very similar to Armored Approach. It also does get a B tier. It's similar in that regard too. Armored Approach is block 8, next card costs 1 more, rebound. This one is block 8, next card costs 1 more, but instead of rebound, it's just 0 cost. And I do think Clashing Steel is a little bit better in general, because since it's 0 cost, that means that if you have a pretty tough turn and you just need to do like a lot of defense, You can spend all your energy on blocking or whatever it is you need to do, and then end your turn with the 0-cost Clashing Steel and just carry that tempo into the next turn. So it has that going for it. It's a good carrier of Void Stones for that reason too, because as a 0-cost card, you can always play it out to trigger those Void Stones. The upgrade on it as well, going up to 12 block, it's pretty solid, right? You put a yellow stone on this thing, you upgrade it 0, energy block 16. That's pretty solid, even if you do have to deal with that tempo. But it just doesn't have any, like, exceptional niche or anything, so it's really only ever just going to be a pretty good block card. Definitely worthy of B tier. Next we have Close In. Another B tier block for Tempest. 2 for 11 is not the most efficient thing in the world, but 25% rage and 25% delay rage is quite appealing. That's going to represent a pretty decent amount of damage. If you upgrade it 2 for 16, that's a pretty good deal. You know, that's pretty competitive with other 2-cost blocks. So very often, you'll just immediately want to slot this in over one of your existing block cards, and it might not be a huge improvement, but it will be an improvement. So it is pretty good for that. Next, we have Contraposition, and Contraposition is certainly an A-tier card. It's one of her best commons. This thing is super powerful, very flexible. You're almost never going to be upset to see this thing in your hand, right? Even just at face value, 1 energy, draw 1, zeal 1, that's not bad. You know, it's a little bit of zeal generation, it's a little bit of consistency, and when this card gets really crazy, of course, is when you have tempo. And, you know, you play some, like, rollover or something like that, you play, like, a Great Lunge or whatever, immediately just throw out the Contraposition, it wipes away all the tempo effectively, draws you deeper through the deck, it gets you a whole bunch of zeal, really, really powerful option, and it's not that hard to get multiples of this, because it's a common, of course. It works great with the Purge effects, the handful of Purge effects that Tempest have, where it's +1 energy and next card costs 1 more. Those are really good with Contraposition. The stuff that gives lots of tempo, so anything that gives 2 or more just makes this card go absolutely insane. But even just for 1 tempo, it's still really good. You will almost always want to put this card in your deck, even if you don't have any tempo. Almost S-tier worthy, to be honest. It's that good, but just barely I think it misses out. It's not guaranteed to be an auto-include, even if it's something you put in like 80% of decks, I would say. Great card, though. Definitely a great one. Next, we have Crackling Aura. This one is unfortunately going to be our first C tier. It's not a very impressive card. Even after it got a little bit of a buff boosting up the raw block, 6 block for 1, pretty mediocre, and, you know, of course you are getting that overcharge. The problem with Crackling Aura is that it's usually going to be pretty significantly outclassed in every aspect, right? If you just want block, obviously it's not that good. If you want overcharge, it's not that good. If you want just like cheap defense, there's other options. Even if you're specifically saying, I want block and overcharge, we just talked about a weighted assault earlier, right? You put an upgrade on that thing, and you're getting block and overcharge and 50% rage. You put an upgrade on this thing, you're getting a little bit more block. You know, I mean, like 1 for 10 is fine, right? That's pretty good, but it's just not often gonna find a home because it's so middling in its 2 effects. You can make do with it in the early game, I guess. If you have like literally no overcharge, this is worth running just for that. But most of the time, you're gonna find something better to fill that deck slot. So C tier. Next, we have Dissipate. Another starting block for Tempest. This one, I'm going to say, is also a C tier. It's a weird one. 2 for 11 in the starting deck is really good, actually. It makes it pretty easy to take on early elites. It's very efficient in that aspect. But what's not so great about it is that Discharge 1 effect. Especially in the early game, when you're not going to have that much overcharge, pretty often you'll just be losing all of your overcharge to Dissipate, whether you want to or not, in cases where you'd much rather be holding on to that overcharge to increase your energy gain. Instead, you're applying Shock 3 to all enemies, which isn't bad, of course, but it can definitely be a lot worse than the energy you get from your overcharge. So you'll pretty much always just be replacing Dissipates the minute you find another comparable block card, right? Any big block card is probably an upgrade over Dissipate. You usually want to have at least a couple smaller blocks as well, just so that you're more flexible. So you'll probably be replacing some Dissipates with cheaper blocks as soon as you find those too. They just tend to make their way out of the deck very quickly, and you really won't want to bring them back in almost ever. So for that reason, we're giving it a C tier. Next up, we have Electric Kite. This is a very funky one, very unique card. Base cost of 0 is not very common. Unfortunately, this one's also going to be C tier. It doesn't do anything, period, if you have no overcharge, which is unfortunate. So, especially in those early game scenarios, when the overcharge is hard to come by, especially if you're on Dissipates that are eating up all of your overcharge, this is not very good. If you do have overcharge, 0 for 6, but then you lose the 1 overcharge, that's like an okay deal. The opener effect is mostly what you would want. Of course, it's pretty easy to get this as the opener because, you know, it's free. You don't even need to think about it. You can just throw it out immediately, and then 2 overcharge down for 12 block and 0 energy spent. That's a pretty good deal. That can bail you out of some situations. But, you know, if you have to play a card to gain that overcharge, then you're missing the opener now, right? So at least it has a purge effect in those situations. Purge for Zeal 1 is pretty nice. The upgrade for it, just, you know, increasing the block a little bit, that's okay, but it doesn't really address the primary issue with this card, which is just its inherent clunkiness. I'm not a big fan of this one myself. Just about the only time I would make use of this is if I'm just drowning in overcharge that I'm not making any significant use of, or I don't know, if I have Monkey Paw or something and I just want 0 costs. Not a big fan of this one for sure. Next up we have Exhilaration, another 0 coster. This one I'm also going to give C tier. 0 energy for 1 overcharge is pretty bad. You wouldn't play that. But obviously it's got that Zeal 5 rebound effect. And so now you're paying 0 energy for 2 overcharge. That's not so bad. You put a Void Stone in this thing too. You're getting extra value out of that. Okay, we're kind of cooking now, right? But that is a decent amount of investment. You got to put the stone in this thing. You got to set up around it. Even if you put a stone in this and you aren't hitting that Zeal 5, it's pretty underwhelming. Of course, since it's a 0 cost itself, it does not help you hit your Zeal threshold at all. The upgrade on this one, letting you trigger the Void Stone, does ameliorate that to a small extent, because now you can just purge it and you're still getting value out of the stone. That's probably the best thing you can be doing with this, to be honest, is just purging it to get value out of your stone, but with an upgrade and a stone committed to it, that's, you know, there's going to be a lot of other cards that are some stiff competition for your upgrades and stones. It's pretty good to get this as a random common from the various Zeal effects that can give you those and stuff. I'll at least give it that. As a 0 coster, it's a pretty nice random volatile common to get. But overall, it's just pretty unimpressive. Next we have Feedback. Continuing a streak of C tiers here. Yeah, yet another C tier for Feedback. This one is a very awkward card. You're gaining block equal to the target's shock, half of it, right? And then you're dealing 5 damage, which triggers shock and halves the shock. So it wants you to have a lot of shock on an enemy, but then it immediately is reducing that shock. It's not a particularly effective damage dealer in itself, so like you'd probably rather be saving that shock to use with like your smite or some other more impactful card. The upgrade on this one boosts the damage by just a bit. It's not particularly interesting. Just, you know, not a very good card in general. If you don't have shock, it's horrible. If you just have a little bit of shock, it's like a bad riposte, and riposte is already not a very good card. So that is not a good spot to be in when you're unfavorably getting compared to one of the weakest cards in the game. So, sorry feedback, you are a C tier card. Finally, getting out of the C tiers though, we've got Flux. Flux is actually pretty decent. It's a B tier card. It's effectively 0 energy, and after you upgrade it, same deal. Effectively 0 energy. It gives you access to some tempo synergy, and it's just a nice source of shock. Getting up to 5 or up to 10 shock for no effective energy spent is pretty good. That's quite a bit of shock, and if you're low on energy, the fact that it's decreasing the next card means that you can just eke out that little bit of extra value to do your 2-card combo. It does not work with X costs, notably, so like, you know, if you have that starting smite, the minus cost isn't helping there, but it's good with basically every other kind of fight-ending attack you might want to use. It's not exactly a standout in any particular regard, but it will certainly get the job done. So that is worthy of a B tier. Next, we have Forked Thrust. This one is also a B tier. 1 cost for 10 damage is pretty okay, and then you throw in on top of that damage equal to half of the target's shock to all the other enemies. So it becomes a pretty nice AoE card. I definitely like this a lot in the early game. At the very start of a run, this is a really good pickup to help you crush through some of those regular combats. It's not the best in Elites in Act 1, of course, but it is really good at handling all sorts of other early game threats, like the garden, the gnomes and the red caps, those guys. It's good against them. It's good against the dogs. It's just a handy little card to have early on. You will almost certainly cut this by the time you're in the mid-game, pretty much certainly by the time you're in the late game. But it'll have done pretty good work in all likelihood up until that point. Upgrade on this one is just, you know, whatever, plus 4 damage, nothing to write home about. It is a acceptable early game damage card. Next up, another starter card, but one that you can get extra copies of, Galvanize. Galvanize is also going to be a B tier card. It's quite good in the starter deck that you get it with. 2 overcharge is pretty nice on a 3-coster, and the damage is not as much as you would have, as you'd like to get from a 3-cost attack, but that's because the overcharge is going to be paying back quite a bit of that energy. So it ends up being a pretty efficient damage dealer. Hits hard, helps you with those early game fights quite a bit, and if you find extra copies, you probably aren't going to put them in if you already were starting with 2. But if you're on the other starter deck with the batters and such, you could be pretty happy to find a Galvanize early on. It's nice as an expensive card if you have lots of minus tempo, or if you're just gaining huge amounts of energy that you need to spend on something. It's pretty good for that. The upgrade, just giving it extra damage, is not one I would usually recommend going for unless you're just really desperate for heavy hitting cards. That overcharge 2 is really the star of the show here. Pretty solid early and mid-game option. Next card is Gambit. Gambit is also B tier. This one is kind of comparable to a weighted assault. It's got the delay rage 50%. The base effect being slow instead of the block equal to energy on a weighted assault is definitely a downgrade, I would say, so that's why we are putting this one in B tier, whereas a weighted assault was A tier, because slow is not particularly useful in a general sense. There's plenty of enemies that don't care about being slowed, so, you know, if they have one frenzy, it literally does nothing, or, you know, if they have a whole crap ton of frenzy, like firebugs or something, dropping it down by 1 isn't that impactful, right? When they're attacking for 3 times 7, 3 times 6 is not a huge deal. So that's kind of mediocre about it, but where it shines is that upgrade. Purge Block 5, that is a really good effect. So you could be very happy to have this card if you've got upgrade points to spare coming up. It's a really competitive upgrade. Definitely will say that, because now it has a really nice dual use case where you can get the rage, or you can just purge it for block, and especially if you're in a fight where that slow doesn't matter, having the purge effect becomes very relevant. So quite a bit weaker before upgrade than a weighted assault, but if you're comparing them both upgraded, it's a pretty even matchup. Pretty nice little card. Next is Gathering Storm. We're just continuing the chain of B tiers. This is another B tier card. 2 for 9 shock is not phenomenal, but if you're getting 2 overcharge back out of the deal, that actually is really good. Especially if you upgrade it. You're getting extra shock and extra overcharge if you can change this card's cost. That is really good. So obviously this becomes better the more access to tempo you have. If you can get some Zeal powers unlocked that are going to give you tempo, that's really good. If you have any of those Purge cards that give you tempo, it's really great with Gathering Storm. By the late game, it's often trivial to trigger the condition on Gathering Storm, and it's going to be a real superstar at that point. In the early game, it's a lot less impressive, so that's why it gets a B tier. But you're never really too upset to find this thing. Even if it's just sitting in your backpack waiting until the right stuff shows up to make it work, very often it'll come out of that backpack. So, good B tier card. Next we have Greased Lightning. And finally we get to break the streak of B tiers. This is an A tier card. I'm a big fan of this one. 3 for 25, it's pretty chunky. And then with that Discharge 5, Draw 2, that is a great discharge effect. You're really happy if you can trigger this in early fights. It has a pretty good chance that it's just one-shotting one of the enemies, and then it's giving you fuel to pick off extra enemies. Or in a single target fight, it's just dumping more damage probably onto whatever you hit with this thing. It's really, really good with the Bulging Capacitor. Cheating out that discharge effect is super powerful. And if you upgrade it, which you will often want to do, 33 damage. That is a lot. That is an awful lot. This one often stays in the deck relatively late into the game even, after the ability to just hit something for a big number stops being as relevant, because that draw effect is very helpful for setting up whatever your deck is trying to do, really. If you just need to, if you want to get to your shock generators, if you want to get to buffs, whatever it is you're looking to find, being able to draw 2, very helpful. So, great A tier card. Next we've got Grounded, another starter card that you can find extra copies of. This one is also going to be A tier. It's really good. So in the starting deck where you get 2 of them, you pretty much always, I'd say, like to keep both of them in. At the least until you can upgrade one of them. Once you've upgraded one, the second copy becomes kind of redundant. And if you're on the other deck and you just find one of these randomly, you're probably going to want to put it in, you're probably going to want to upgrade it. One upgraded Grounded is really nice. Really, really nice to have. And even unupgraded, it's pretty good. Both of the effects that it provides are very relevant, Overcharge and Rage. It's going to pay for itself pretty quickly from that Overcharge, and especially once you've upgraded it, getting 2 Overcharge every other turn. That's really, really nice. It's an Expel card to thin your deck out. It just has a lot going for it. Very generally useful card. You'd be hard-pressed to find a situation where having one of these in play would not significantly improve your ability to deal with whatever it is you're facing. Very, very nice card. Next, we have Growing Static. You always hear me on stream talking about how important vulnerable access is. Growing Static says vulnerable on it. Nevertheless, it's a C-tier card, because this is one of the worst sources of vulnerable that you can get on Tempest. You know, it's better than nothing is about the most positive I can be towards Growing Static. It's so expensive. Shock 8 is, you know, it's decent. Vulnerable 2 is good if you don't have to deal with adaptation. If you're losing that extra stack of vulnerable, then it's just miserably bad. You know, clearly the idea with this card is that you play it, and then on the second turn, after you've played this, or you play it on one turn, and then the turn after that, they've still got the shock, of course. They're still vulnerable, and you now have delay rage. Hopefully you can, you know, refill your energy because you spent so much on this thing. That's the idea with this card. Very often that does not end up being the reality. What if you don't draw the attacks you were looking for on the next turn? What if the vulnerable is gone because you have adaptation, or because it's one of several enemies that can purge their vulnerable? What if you don't end up having the energy you need to play those attack cards because this thing is so freaking expensive, right? Like, there's a lot of ways that simple plan can go wrong. The upgrade on it, giving you extra shock and delay rage, but not extra vulnerable, that's just like salt in the wound, man. Obviously, the extra vulnerable would be so much more valuable, but you don't get any. It doesn't get any cheaper or anything. All of the big problems about this card, there's really no way to solve them, short of just playing this thing on the same turn that you're dealing your attacks. And then, of course, you're not getting value from the delay rage. And if you have that much energy to spend, you know, like, is Growing Static really the best thing that you could be doing anyway? Maybe you'd be better spent just dumping the energy into an X cost or something. It is a card that I like less and less the more I play with it. So, unfortunately, it's going to be C tier. Next up, we have a Guidance. Guidance is a B tier card. It's okay. It's another 2-cost block, so this one is kind of similar to Growing Static in that it's a great thing to just put in instead of a Dissipate. 2 for 12 is fine. Nothing to write home about, but it's not that bad. If you get the Zeal 7, so that you're getting that nice refund, that's pretty good. Keep in mind, of course, if you didn't know, cards with Zeal conditionals like this, they do count towards their own Zeal. So if you have 5 Zeal and you play this thing, it bumps you up to 7, triggers that effect. So it's not the hardest thing in the world to get the Zeal to go off, although you will miss it from time to time, especially in the early game. And that makes it look quite a bit worse, but by the late game, it's not that hard to get the Zeal effect. The only reason you probably wouldn't be playing this in the late game is because there's a decent number of better cards, but this one's not bad. Upgrade on it, extra block, it's fine. Kind of a boring card, unfortunately, but it's not bad at least. So, B tier. Next we've got Heavy Handed, and boy do I love this card. This is an easy A tier for me. Each time you play a heavy card, Zeal 1, that is a lot of Zeal. And where this card really shines, though, is once you upgrade it, when you're getting 2 shock as well each time you play a heavy card. A lot of your best attacks are heavy attacks, and this thing just makes them that much better. You will be swimming in Zeal more often than not if you throw this power down. This is a great one to rig. It's going to give you a lot of value from triggering Zeal powers that you would have missed otherwise. The shock might not seem like a lot, but it's just completely free, right? You don't even have to think about it. Just extra value, extra damage. Really, really handy. If you put down 2 copies of Heavy Handed, maybe you put a Blackstone in this thing, or you just find 2 of them, things get really out of hand with the Zeal. You'll be hitting your Zeal 10 more often than not at that point, almost guaranteed, assuming you have, like, any heavy cards at all. It's a really nice common buff coming in at only 1 energy. This is a really, really good one. It's not as generally applicable as a card like Grounded, because, you know, you might not have those heavy cards, but usually you will. And when it does come up, it's so impactful. So that's an easy A tier, if you ask me. Next, we've got Hope. This card's nuts. This is an S tier card. It's so powerful. I mean, just read the first line of text, draw X cards. That's ridiculous. That's so good. The discharge is not a conditional thing like a lot of other cards where it'll say, you know, discharge 1, blah, blah, blah. It's its own line of text, so if you don't have any overcharge, you can still play this card. No questions asked. It works exactly the same. The ability to gain a bunch of effective zeal off this thing is great. The ability to filter your deck for the exact cards you want is great. It's really good with purge effects, so if you have thwarts and you're getting a bunch of zeal from that, you know, if this card wasn't generating enough zeal already, there you go. It's good with the blocking effects, like on Gambit that we were talking about earlier. It is really good for fueling any sort of X cost synergy you might have, because you're happy to play this card for any value of X, effectively, right? Besides 0. Even just paying 1 energy for this thing is not that bad, right? Super flexible. It fits into basically any deck. I really can't imagine a situation where I wouldn't want to replace at least 1 card in my deck with a Hope. And, oh boy, the upgrade. It just does not get any better than this, man. You get an extra Hope in hand, which is absurd. That's so good. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. That's just ridiculous, right? Like, you get to... You draw a bunch of cards, and if you don't like the cards you drew, purge them, throw that into the volatile Hope you just got. You know, do it again. You will find what you need. When you have an upgraded Hope to play with a bunch of energy, you will find what you need. Pretty much just draw your whole deck. This card is crazy. Next, we've got Intervention. Intervention is an A tier card. It's quite good. 6 block X times is a really nice, flexible block card. It's reasonably competitive at just about every value of X, besides 1. But playing it for 2, 3, or even 4 is going to get you quite a bit of block compared to other similar cost cards. The Expel tag is not bad if you're trying to thin your deck out a little bit, you know, that's always handy. And especially in the early game, when you might just be needing to deal with 1 turn in particular, where suddenly there's a whole bunch of damage on the stack. This is really good for that. This is great to make sure, for example, that you don't take chip damage versus Skeletal Mage and trigger his passive. It's really good against the early bosses. The upgrade on it, quite nice too. Plus 1 block per energy you spend on it, and that handy-dandy purge effect in case you don't need it. Want to save it for later? Just get some free zeal out of the equation. Why not? Quite nice to replace a block card with, usually. It's a very favorable comparison to other common blocks. Next, we got one of the new cards, Invoke. Invoke is going to be a B tier card. It's how good Invoke is depends a lot on what your Zeal tree looks like, because this thing is a Zeal machine. Zeal 3 on the card text, plus the 1 energy, of course, that you're spending for it, means you're getting 4 total Zeal out of this thing, which is a heck of a lot for something that you only spent 1 energy on. Makes it really easy to trigger your Zeal powers. You're getting a bunch of shock out of it, too. It does come with that negative tempo, of course, but if you're just trying to turbo out a bunch of Zeal, that's just plus 1 more point of Zeal when you play your next card. So that would effectively be 5 points of Zeal from this one guy, which is pretty nifty. The upgrade on this thing is also a little bit crazy. Purge Zeal 2 is quite a line of text to have on a card. And you don't have to deal with any potential downside or whatever if you don't want the plus tempo at that point. Upgrading this thing, it's just going to start spitting out Zeal. So if you got a really good 10 or a 7 that you're having trouble hitting, this card will be a huge help in that regard. If you're already generating a whole bunch of Zeal, or you're not relying on your Zeal powers all that much, then it's not very good. As a pure shock generator, it's got a very high ceiling, of course, right? Like, if you have, a bunch of hopes, or, artifacts that are giving you Zeal and stuff, this can still be a lot of shock for 1 energy, but there's a lot of other ways to get shock, and it's not always going to be competitive with those options. So it's pretty volatile in terms of how good it actually is. Going to vary a lot from run to run, but on the whole, it's pretty good. So we're going to give it B tier for that. Next, we've got Issue Challenge. Huge 4-coster. B tier for me on this one. 4 energy is obviously a lot to ask, and 21 block it's quite a bit. Maybe not quite as much as you would expect, though. You look at something like Tower Shield blocking for 30. You're paying a whole extra energy, and you're getting quite a bit less block, right? But that Delay Rage 50, it matters quite a bit. That is a really significant improvement in your damage. And it's also a lot of Zeal, of course, paying 4 for it. If you can upgrade this thing, you get a smidgen more block, but now Delay Rage 75. That is a lot of extra damage you can deal next turn. It's pretty decent in the early game to handle those big spike damage turns where the enemy just hits you for a whole lot all at once. Holding this thing from one turn to the next to prepare for that is pretty reasonable. And then since the next turn, after you take a whole bunch of damage, is often a less threatening turn, you'll be more easily able to take advantage of that delay rage. Very often, this is going to come out once you reach the mid and late game, but it's not at all bad until that point. And, sometimes you're just swimming in energy, and you don't mind spending so much on this thing. It's pretty good. Next, we've got Jolt. Jolt is also a B tier card. A lot of the stuff that I said about Invoke in terms of shock generation kind of applies to Jolt as well. It's pretty reasonable shock generation if you're able to jump through the hoops that it asks you to. That Discharge 2 for getting the extra trigger on it is not bad, especially, you can slap a purple stone in this thing, and now you're discharging 2 overcharge, but you're getting that overcharge back. On upgrade, getting up to 18 shock for 1 energy is a pretty good deal. But there are plenty of other ways to get shock too. You might be wanting to spend your overcharge on a whole host of other things. This can be a 1-card solution to your shock needs if you're desperate, but it's certainly not the optimal choice in most cases. But coming in at common, if you're just looking for shock, this is an okay way to get it. You won't always have those other options. Next, we've got Juiced Up. I really like Juiced Up. I'm going to give this guy an A. Juiced Up has the ability to block for a whole heck of a lot by the time you're in the mid or late game. In the early game, it's not very impressive in the block department, but it is very impressive in its upgrade. Purge Overcharge 1 on a card that you can have in your deck and upgraded really early in the run is a really big deal. That 1 overcharge matters a whole heck of a lot in the early game, right? So finding this out of a chest, for example, and spending that chest upgrade point on the Juiced Up immediately feels pretty good, and you won't regret having spent the upgrade point on this card, because by the late game, you're probably going to be sitting on a whole bunch of overcharge, and then it just becomes a pretty good block card. And even if it doesn't, purge effects are always pretty good to have. You're going to have to purge at least some number of cards almost every turn, so why not get some value out of it? This is a pretty good one. I really, really like picking this up early on. And even in the late game, if I if I have upgrade points to spare, I can still find myself slotting this into the deck. If you have the Zeal ability that upgrades a card in your deck, this is a really nice target for that. Just a very handy card to have overall. I'm a big fan. Next we have Languish. Languish, I am not a big fan of. This one's a C tier for me. It, I mean, just read it, right? 2 energy for 2 weak, draw 1 card. So the 1 card you draw obviously helps to offset the cost of this thing. You can immediately purge that. You've effectively only spent 1 energy. Do you want to spend 1 energy to apply 2 weak to 1 enemy, though? I sure don't. That's not a lot of weak. There are a whole bunch of enemies that will not attack you twice in a row. Some of them don't ever attack you twice in a row, and with a bunch of others it's just, you know, random whether they will or won't. But pretty likely that they won't. And when that happens, you're only getting 1 turn of value out of the weakness. If you have Adaptation, then you're only ever getting 1 turn of value out of the weakness. It's just not a very impressive card at all. Tempest doesn't particularly value weakness all that much anyway, so, you know, meh, right? Like, Tempest is much more about just killing things quickly, and you don't really need to care about exactly how much damage they're dishing out, because they'll be dead pretty quick. And Languish does not help you kill things, like, at all. It's a very middling way to generate some zeal, I suppose. But very infrequently would I want to put this card in my deck. Even trying to tech it in for specific fights that I'm worried about, I have not really had good results with this thing almost ever. So it gets a C tier for that. Moving on, we have Moment's Reprieve. Moment's Reprieve is a pretty interesting one. This is a very unique card. I'm going to put it in B tier. 0 cost, overcharge 3 is wild, but then your next card costs +2, which is a very significant downside. But there are, of course, plenty of ways to mitigate that downside or even take advantage of it. So, you know, this is a really good one with Contraposition. It's really good with Shift Polarity. It's great with some of the other cards that care about their own cost that we'll get to later. It's, you know, it's reasonable enough even with something like Growing Static. And it also has that handy-dandy purge effect that I've mentioned a few times now. Or, no, excuse me. This is, it has a different purge effect. Discharge 1 to gain 1 energy. That's quite good, right? Purging this thing when you have Overcharge gives you 2 energy immediately. It costs you energy in the future, but, you know, energy now is more valuable than energy later, by and large. It's a good way to fuel your X costs. It's a good way to set up your specific synergies. It's a very nice card. The upgrade on this one, getting you 1 extra overcharge is okay. It's not that bad. It's a decent carrier of Void Stones as a 0-coster. It's pretty decent. If you already have quite a bit of overcharge, or you don't particularly care about tempo, it's not the most impressive, but you might still be able to find room for it. Very infrequently is this card completely useless, I'd say. Moving on, we have Paragon. Paragon is not that great. It's a C tier card, if you ask me. In the very early game, it's kind of nice. You know, 7 damage, 5 block, 1 overcharge is not so bad when you're fighting enemies with like 20 health, right? But pretty quickly, this thing is going to start falling off. By just like the middle of floor 1, it's mostly just useful as a overcharge card. The fact that it's heavy can be relevant too. It has a lot of tags, right? It's an attack, it's a block, it's a heavy. So there's ways to synergize with it. But it just doesn't really excel in any area. It falls off pretty quickly in terms of raw value in every aspect that it touches on. You're going to want to replace it sooner or later. The upgrade is not that good. It doesn't get you extra overcharge, which is what you would want most. Yeah, very mediocre card. Next, we've got Power Spike. This one is another pretty weird one, tough to evaluate. It's similar to Invoke in that it cares a lot about your Zeal tree. We're going to give it B tier because, even ignoring your Zeal tree completely, Purge Shock 1 to everybody, that's not bad. And if you upgrade it Shock 3 to everybody, that's actually quite impressive. That's a lot of shock, right? Up to 9 shock just for purging a card, good deal. As for actually playing it, though, to trigger your Zeal 10, huge variance in terms of how good or bad this effect is. Hilariously, if you have the ability to gain volatile commons from your Zeal 10, you can Power Spike into Power Spike, which is always funny. That's a pretty good result. It can help you access a Zeal 10 even in a deck that's not gaining much Zeal the normal way. So if you've upgraded, if you've purchased a 10 using your Fervor, just because you're happy with your other Zeals and you need to get some value, or if the upgrades on your existing Zeals are marginal, you might want to just pick up a 10, and this actually lets you get more value out of that, so that's pretty handy. There's if you have like the block 8 on your Zeal 10, for example, 1 mana for 8 with a potentially very beneficial purge effect, that's not a bad card at all. But other times you won't really care about this. If you're already triggering your Zeal 10 the natural way, playing this to double dip on it can be kind of fun. It's got a lot of neat utility to it. It's never usually like a crazy card. It isn't often going to be one of your best cards. But it's definitely not bad, and that upgraded purge effect is definitely something that you might want to take a look at if you've been glossing over this card. Purge for Shock 3, it's a lot more impactful than it sounds, I promise you. Next up, we've got Powered Shield. This one is B tier. 3 energy for 14 block is not a great efficiency, but getting that discharge 3, 28 total block for the cost of only 3 energy, that's really good. This is another one that's great with the Bulging Capacitor. Doing early elite fights, this will make you feel a lot safer when 3 for 14 is like kind of tolerable. The upgrade on it, lowering that discharge cost, is really nice because 3 is a big ask. 2 feels a lot better. 30 total block on this thing for 3, right? It's like a reusable tower shield that just eats some of your overcharge. It's pretty okay. Next up, we've got Prime Quarry. This is the vulnerable that you want on Tempest. This is an A tier card. This is so much better than Growing Static. It's vulnerable to everybody. That's really good. It's Shock 2 to everybody. That's just a nice little cherry on top. And if you upgrade it, Shock 4 to everyone. That's actually a pretty significant amount of shock at that point. It's cheap. It's a good carrier of many stones. You can even put a black stone on this thing to really go crazy stacking up the debuffs. It's very good. It's probably the easiest way to get some good vulnerable going in Tempest as a 1-cost common. Great card. Next up, we've got Quake. Quake is also an A tier card. It's a really big AoE damage dealer in the early game. When you can just play this as your opener, and you're going to deal 14 damage to one guy and 8 to everybody after that, that is going to seriously simplify a lot of those early fights. It's just going to kill enemies left, right, and center. And then when you don't want to play this as your opener, or if you draw into it mid-turn and stuff, no big deal. Just get to Zeal 5 and play this. The 2 energy will get you the rest of the way. Pretty good. If you upgrade it, even the Zeal threshold goes down, so you only need 3 Zeal before you play it. And the damage goes up pretty significantly too, plus 3 total damage. Some of that being AoE, so you're multiplying that damage increase by however many enemies are in the fight. This thing is very good. Very, very good at killing early fights. It's not bad later on either. You know, it still has its uses in the mid-game. It's a heavy card, so that's pretty good. It's got synergy going for it there. It's almost always worth playing up until maybe the very late game, when you might have some better stuff to put in over this card, but it sticks around quite often into the late game for me. Next up, we've got Quick Charge, and this is actually going to be the second S-tier common for Tempest, which is kind of crazy, but, you know, I mean, what can I say? Just Tempest things. She is a really strong character. Quick Charge is ridiculous. It draws you cards, it gives you a lot of overcharge, the upgrade is huge, getting rebound on this thing. You play this card twice, you've gained 4 overcharge, you've drawn 2 cards, you've gained 4 zeal. You probably have put a stone in this thing, often purple stone, and this is the go-to. And now you've got 2 extra overcharge on top of the 4 you already gained naturally. Yellow stone in this one is another favorite of mine. It's ridiculous. It is so good. I will put the caveat that that's mostly predicated on the fact that you upgrade this thing. You really want to upgrade this. As a general rule of thumb, any card that upgrades to get rebound is a really high priority upgrade. But what a workhorse card, man. It does everything you can ever want. This is often pretty much the only overcharge source you need in the early game, and it's going to be a significant part of your overcharge generation by the late game. It's a phenomenal mastery pick, just an all-around wonderful card. You can hardly go wrong with this thing, even in multiples. I've played up to 3 of these at once, and it never felt excessive. Very, very good card. Moving on. Next is Rebuke. Rebuke is an A-tier card, I would say. It's pretty good. It's a big old chunky hit. 3 for 24 is not bad at all. And that discharge effect generates quite a bit of zeal. 6 zeal just from playing this card and triggering the discharge effect. Means that if you play literally anything else that costs energy this turn, you'll be at least hitting your zeal 7. That's not bad. Especially in the early game, that discharge one can be a bit of a drawback, kind of like with Dissipate, but that's not as big of a deal because with Dissipate, you know, you're extending the fight when you play it. You're blocking. With Rebuke, you can often be ending those early fights when you play it, and then it doesn't matter if you've lost some overcharge because the fight's over. The upgrade on this is a pretty big one, going up to 32 damage. That is a chunky hit. Obviously, it's a heavy card, which is good. Just a very nice early option for big damage. You know, this will help you kill your first boss. This will help you kill elites. It's a good card. It does fall off. It does fall off once you get towards the late game sometimes. But it can stick around for a surprisingly long time. This is a pretty decent mastery pickup as well. After Rebuke, we have Roll Over. Roll Over is an interesting one. We're going to give it a B. This card is pretty polarized. Early on, especially if you get an upgrade on this thing, it's a 1-card answer to an entire fight. You know, if you're fighting a 3-enemy fight, Roll Over pretty often just kills all of them. With just a little bit of setup, it will carry you through the first, like, 7 fights or something that are AoE. Pretty crazy. The next card cost 2 is definitely quite the drawback if you're not actually killing all the enemies and ending the fight on the spot. But if you're at least killing 1 or 2, Slay to get back that energy, that's a great way to recuperate from the tempo increase. Again, it's good with you know, your contrapositions and similar cards that care about tempo. It's pretty tough to justify keeping this in the deck all that late through a run. It falls off quite hard, but it's so good in the early game that I do think it's deserving of a B. Finding this from an early fight or a chest or something is just such a slam dunk on the early game. So it's a funky one, but we will put it in B. Next we got Rolling Thunder. This one I'm gonna put as a B. It's a pretty good way to get Overcharge, and it's a pretty good way to get Shock. It's not the most amazing in either of those, but it can solve two problems at the same time even. That's not bad. Getting an upgrade on this thing to get an extra trigger on Overcharge and Shock is really nice when you're playing this thing for lower amounts of energy. If you want to just dump a bunch of energy into something, if you have excess, this is a great way to do that. It can definitely solve early elite fights for you with all that shock. You know, pairs quite nicely with something like that starting smite you might have. But it will definitely fall off as you get later. You're almost certainly going to find better ways to do Overcharge and Shock. But it is still a pretty succinct way to handle both of those at the same time. So even if you do have better ways of getting Overcharge and better ways of getting Shock, they're probably going to be coming from different sources. So getting it all at once can be good. It's not bad. It's not bad at all. One of the nicer ways to get Shock in the early game, I'll say. Next up is Rumble. Rumble is a pretty nifty card. This one will be a B tier. One energy deals 7 is, you know, it's fine. But then when you play a heavy card, getting 2 energy back, that's really quite good. Anytime you play a card in Vault, you have to consider that you didn't purge it, right? So each card kind of has 1 energy in opportunity cost associated with it. So when you play Rumble, you spend 1 energy on it and you lose out on the fact that you could have purged this, right? So it's like 2 energy down. Then you play a heavy card, it comes back. This 7 damage is effectively completely free. Especially if you upgrade it so that it doesn't require you to play the heavy card on the same turn. And now it's dealing 9 damage. 9 damage completely free. That's pretty good. It's good to be able to like set up specific combos, or like maybe you want to be able to play that heavy card, but you wouldn't have enough energy to also block afterwards. Well, this will give you back that energy. You can just throw this down early, and it's like you're banking that energy for later. So that can help you not have excess energy if there's a bunch of cards you wanted to purge or something. Throw some energy. You throw some energy into the Rumble, and then you retrieve it later when you play a heavy card. Not at all bad. It can be a good volatile common to get as well. So certainly has a decent number of uses, but the ceiling on it is relatively low. This is not a card that's going to define your deck or your run in any way, but it's just a nice little bit of nice little synergy to throw into a heavy-oriented deck. So it's a B-tier card for sure. Next up, we have Sacrament. Sacrament is quite nice. We're going to throw this one in B-tier as well. 7 block for 1 is fine. Nothing super impressive. But it's got these really handy Zeal synergies. Or, excuse me, Tempo synergies. So if you have minus tempo, you're going to get 2 Zeal. And if you have plus tempo when you play this thing, it gives you some free minus tempo. So this is a great way to take advantage of stuff that interacts with tempo in pretty much any way, because it's good if you already have tempo. It lets you set up tempo. It gives you a pretty respectable amount of block along the way, especially if you upgrade this thing. Block 10 for 1 is pretty good. And Zeal 3, if the card costs 0. That's a lot of Zeal, right? You know, you're missing out on Zeal normally when you get minus tempo, but this completely flips that on its head. Now you're gaining quite a bit. That is a really neat little 2-card combo you can do. Just anything that gives -1 tempo, and then this, and boom, tons of Zeal. It's just a nice filler block card otherwise, though. Definitely worthy of B tier. Next up, we have Seek Higher Power. This one, it might surprise you a little bit. I'm going to put in A tier. Reading this card, it doesn't sound like the most amazing thing. Overcharge 1, draw and discard 2. 1 extra overcharge if you do it as an opener. The upgrade, just +1 overcharge on the base effect. It's certainly not a bad card. I don't think that this would usually be considered an A tier card if it weren't for the fact that Tempest does not have access to a lot of deck cycling. She doesn't have all that much draw. She doesn't have all that much draw and discard. It's really just a couple cards, right? So Hope obviously is crazy. We talked about Quick Charge earlier is a very good card that says draw, but you're only drawing one at a time with Quick Charge. It's pretty expensive. Being able to just churn through your deck and find the specific cards you want is quite a strong thing in Vault. And this is one of relatively few ways that Tempest can get that. The fact that it gives you draw and discard specifically is also handy for dealing with afflictions. Tempest is not super great at dealing with afflictions in general. This is a good way to handle them. And you're getting a decent amount of overcharge too. So, somewhat surprisingly, yeah, it's an A tier for me. I like this one. Next we have Shift Polarity. Shift Polarity, this is the purge effect I was actually talking about earlier. This one is going to be a B tier card. Most of the time, I would say I'm thinking about Shift Polarity from the aspect of the purge effect, because that is a very interesting purge effect. It can be quite strong if you have the right sort of deck to take advantage of it. But the actual effect on play is not bad at all either. Like we mentioned earlier, this is pretty good with Moment's Reprieve. It's certainly a lot less powerful than Contraposition is as a way of handling increased tempo, but it's still pretty solid. Getting overcharge out of the tempo is nice already. The block and delay block is just a sort of bonus. At least that's how I would normally think about it. The upgrade on this thing, doubling the effectiveness of all of these abilities, is pretty cool too. If you are actually trying to play it, that's a very impactful upgrade if you're getting +2 or +3 tempo. Pretty big deal. So it's a pretty handy card for any deck that cares about tempo one way or another. And even if you don't at all care about tempo, this purge effect, being able to give you 2 energy on purge for the purposes of, say, using an X cost card, that's really nice. You know, maybe this pushes your smite up into the kill range versus an early fight. You'll be pretty happy about that. It's a good card. And next up is Shifting Winds. Shifting Winds is another A tier 1 cost common buff for Tempest. She's got quite a few of those. I mean, it's a really simple card, and it's quite good. You spend 1 energy when you play it, plus you have that 1 opportunity cost energy that we were mentioning earlier. And then every other turn it gives you back 1 energy, helping pay for itself. And the +1 max energy is really nice as well. Lets you purge more aggressively if that's something you want to do. It increases the total damage output you can have on your X cost cards. The upgrade on this one, giving it rigged, pretty handy. The sooner you can get this thing down, the sooner it'll start paying for itself. Just a really easy card to take advantage of. You can hardly go wrong with this thing. Honestly, the only time that I don't really want a Shifting Winds in my deck is if I already have too many buffs and the deck is too setup heavy. This is pretty much always a good pick otherwise. Just a very solid card. Next up is Smite. I've been talking about this one quite a bit. It's a B tier card. It is pretty much the worst finisher type card, if you ask me, out of like all of the comparable options. The damage on this one is not that impressive. It doesn't have any sort of unique effect or specific way to take advantage of it. It's just a way to turn your energy into damage. Even upgraded, getting 8 per energy spent on it, it's not bad, but no, it's not exactly inspiring. The reason it gets B tier nonetheless is because this might be the only really good big bursty damage that you have early on, especially when you start with the Thunder deck and you get this as a starter card. This thing is going to be your bread and butter for ending fights, for sure. It's usually advisable to upgrade this thing ASAP in that case, because it's going to end fights for you. You won't really want to keep it around for all that long. Sometimes you don't find better replacements, though. It does happen. It's not super common, and this can make do. It's a good way to take advantage of shock, of course. It's good enough a lot of the time, even if on paper it's a little underwhelming. So because of that, it is a B tier card. Next, we have Static Saber. Static Saber we're going to throw into B tier as well. 1 mana for 9 damage is reasonable. And Shock 3 on top of that, now it's actually looking pretty good. That's quite a bit of damage that we got for just 1 energy once we trigger that Shock. And it's got this handy-dandy discharge effect on it as well. Discharging 1 for 1 energy, just getting energy now instead of later. Just like that purge effect we talked about earlier. Energy now is usually better than energy later. And it lets you afford perhaps an attack that's going to take advantage of that shock you just applied. Pretty decent. The upgrade on this guy, giving you extra damage and extra shock. It's actually a pretty decent upgrade. Whether or not you'll have an upgrade to spare on this thing early on is anybody's guess, of course. And it does fall off as you get later in the run, but it's never really all that bad. So as far as common attacks go, not really too impressive, but it gets the job done. B tier. Next, we have Strike Twice. Boy, did this thing get a heck of a buff in the Tempest patch, and boy, did it need it. This used to be like a below C tier card. It was so terrible. But these days, I'm happy putting it in B tier. It is not the most impressive card in the world, I will admit. Even after the significant buff it got, it's still just okay. But, you know, I mean, it's 11 damage being triggered twice with that discharge effect. It's decent at taking advantage of shock. It's a reasonably hard hitter. It's a heavy card. That's pretty good. Extra triggers, obviously, quite good with Void Stones. If you upgrade this thing, the damage gets to be a bit more respectable. It's like a middle of the road damage dealer. You know, it's gonna hit quite a bit harder than most of your 1-cost attacks. It's gonna hit quite a bit less hard than even something like a Smite often in the early game. But sometimes you want that sort of middle amount of damage, and this will get you there. Next up, we got Swerving Currents, and this gets to be A tier. Swerving Currents is pretty nice. 7 damage to everybody is a very respectable AoE in the early game. Not at all bad. And the solo effect, getting you vulnerable, is very good. So, you know, obviously AoE becoming less valuable when you're fighting a single target, well, the vulnerable is more than going to make up for the lost power of this card. Really good versus elites early on. If you get the upgrade on it, being able to potentially stack 2 turns of vulnerable, pretty good. The increased AoE, also pretty good. Just a really, really good option in the early game. And if you are in the later game and you haven't found good vulnerable yet, this can still help you out quite a bit, even against like floor 2 elites. It's a bit more questionable when it comes to the final fights of the game. Obviously versus like your floor 2 boss, versus quite a few of the Vault Guardians and such, it's not ever really going to have that solo condition because of the minions, or just because of other high health enemies. You know, like the Star Council, right? It's pretty tough to get the vulnerable from this thing. But it does, you know, technically still work against the Void once you're rushing him down at the end. It has its uses. in the late game. It's not worthless, and it's really good early on, so that's worth an A tier. Pretty solid mastery pick, this one. Next, we've got Thwart. Starting block for the Thunder deck. This one is B tier. I mean, 1 energy for 5 is like super duper underwhelming, but Purge Zeal 1 is a very good line of text. Being able to cheese out those Zeal 5s, Zeal 7s is quite handy. You'll definitely want to replace most of your Thwarts, but it's not at all uncommon to leave maybe 1 or 2 in the deck pretty late into the run, just for that Purge effect. Not too much to say about this one, it's just okay. Next, we move into the uncommons. We've got Aftershock. Unfortunately, I kind of have to give this guy a C. I do really like Aftershock. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's a cool card. But its effect is just a little bit too tough to work with. Right? This is a card that generates energy. That's all it does. And it costs 3 energy, plus the 1 opportunity cost for not purging it, to get this thing into play. It's not very easy to get this thing to pay for itself and then start actually really giving you energy. You know, you have to trigger it 5 times on an unupgraded Aftershock before you've earned more energy from this thing than you would have by just purging it. You know, it is an expel card. The upgrade does reduce its cost, which makes the proposition of actually getting energy off this thing a lot better. It's pretty nice if you have a lot of X cost cards. You know, maybe you've got an upgraded Hope or something. That's 2 X cost cards right there. Hope in particular really changes the evaluation of Aftershock. If you have access to Hope, this card's much, much better than it would be otherwise. But it takes a pretty specific deck to really go off with an Aftershock. Especially once you consider, too, this card is not rigged. It doesn't upgrade to rig. You pretty much have to commit a greenstone to this thing if you want to ensure that you're getting good returns on your energy for it. So, sorry, Aftershock. I wish I could rank you higher, but I just can't justify it. Next, we've got Amplify. Amplify is a fun card. I really love all of these excess block turning into other thing kind of cards. They're super fun. This one is going to be a B tier. It's actually very comparable to Hidden's one, Congeal, because it's harder to overblock in as many different ways with Tempest as it is with Hidden, but when you do overblock, it can often be for a lot more. Also, Shock is probably a little more valuable than Bleed in general. It's really easy to turn a large amount of Shock into a kill, like, right now. With, you know, if you have the right kind of cards, you have your X cost attacks and such. This thing can be a whole heck of a lot of damage. It's got the same upgrade as well, removing Expel. This can be like a pretty significant way to burst things down, even moving late into the game. It highly depends, of course, on what sort of blocks you have access to. If you have like Zeals that block, it can be really good. A little situational. But in the worst case scenario, it is still a pretty reasonable 0-cost Expel card, so that's, you know, it's not a bad filler just to thin out the deck. Next up, we've got Ardor. Ardor... maybe this one will be a little contentious, but I'm going to put it in C. I do not like Ardor very much. It's just like a big ol' setup card. Gives you a whole bunch of delay rage. The Zeal is decent as well, right? You're getting twice as much Zeal out of however much energy you put into the Ardor. It's okay to play at almost any value of X. The upgrade, giving you a smidgen of block as well, is, you know, fine. If your draw pile lines up in just the right way, this can be a good way to set up a kill turn. I find it to be a little inconsistent. Yeah, I mean, that's really all there is to it, to be honest. I've had very few runs where this card was good at all. Usually it's just okay-ish at best, or flat out bad. Not a big fan. Next we have At the Ready. At the Ready's really quite good. We're going to give it A tier. It's 5 total zeal on its own, which is a lot. 12 block for 2 is pretty reasonable. You upgrade this thing 14 block for 2 and 6 total zeal. That is a pretty good card. It is a very nice mid-sized blocker. It's useful pretty much at all points of a run. Very infrequently would you not find somewhere to put this in your deck. It's definitely got situations where you don't particularly care about the zeal. You know, some decks don't need that help, but most of them would not mind at all. Next we have Complete Circuit. Big ol' AoE card. This one is B tier. 2 mana for 15 to everybody it's pretty respectable. If you look at it compared to Quake, it's not exactly the most favorable comparison. This is an uncommon, Quake is a common. The damage on this one is not conditional, of course, but you know, it's not super impressive. The Slay effect is a little bit weird as well. It's pretty tough to take advantage of it. I have almost never used the Slay effect at all, to be honest. The upgrade on it is a little weird since it's applying shock after it hits everyone, but like it's got a Slay effect, so this is the thing that you want to be killing with. And if you're killing enemies, then you know they're dead, so you can't apply shock to them. And if you're using the shock to get the kill, you're missing out on the Slay. It's kind of conflicted. Just a little hard to make use of, but at the end of the day, it is just, you know, a reasonably chunky AoE card, and that's good enough to be a B tier. Tempest doesn't have that much AoE, so if this is all you've got to work with, it'll make do. Next we have Conduit. Conduit, I'm gonna say, is an A tier card. It's pretty comparable to Rebuke in that it's a 3-cost card that's just a big ol' chunk of damage. But whereas Rebuke had a pretty small upside with the discharge effect, and sometimes it could be a downside, the Conduit discharge effect is very impactful. Discharge 4 is a big ask, but making your next card cost 3 less is a huge benefit. Sometimes it's actually too much of a discount, and you don't have any other cards that cost 3 or more to fully take advantage of this. But if you do have any other 3-cost cards, you can have a hugely explosive turn whenever you use your Conduit. The upgrade on this one, quite good as well, plus some extra damage and -1 on that discharge cost. Quite nice. It's a really good way to end fights. In single-target fights, it's just going to hit them hard. And in multi-target fights, you know, maybe you kill somebody with this, and then you use the energy savings to kill somebody else. Very good card. Next up is Consecrate. Consecrate is an interesting one. We're going to give it B tier. 8 damage to everybody. It's okay AoE, not bad. You know, I was pretty big on Swerving Currents being 7 damage to everyone. But again, this is an uncommon. The standards are a bit higher. Sift 1. Sift is not something that Tempest has much access to, so this could be pretty good. You know, maybe you took a Dark Deal and you've got a bunch of Voids in your deck. Reasonable way to handle them. It's really good in particular with Voids because getting 3 Zeal when you sift a Void is really nice. But, you know, sifting other afflictions, you get 0 Zeal, which kind of stinks. If there's just a big expensive card in your deck that you don't want to make use of yet, you know, like you have maybe an issue challenge or something, you can gain some benefit from it that way. If you just really need Zeal right now and you don't care about what you're sifting, this is an okay Zeal generator. The upgrade on this one, getting block equal to the cost of the cards you sift, and some extra AoE damage, it's pretty decent. More often than not, though, if I don't have Voids in my deck, I'm not too keen on Consecrate. It's just okay in those situations. But okay is not a bad place to be, and when you do have the Voids, it's quite good, so at least a B tier card to be sure. I don't think it's really creeping up on A tier or anything, but it's a solid B tier. Dedication. This one, I have very similar feelings about this one as I do with Harder. It's another C tier card. It's another uncommon X cost card that has a kind of funky effect, triggering your Zeal 3 twice the next X turns. Obviously, how good this is or isn't can depend in large part on what your Zeal 3 power is, but, you know, whatever it is, it's not going to be the most impactful effect in the world most of the time. Zeal 3s are pretty small in terms of their impact, so triggering it twice, you know, maybe it helps that a little bit, maybe it's completely unnecessary to trigger it twice. You know, like if your Zeal 3 is Touch of War, it kind of doesn't really matter that you're triggering that twice at all. You'd be just as happy triggering it once, or not using Dedication in the first place, because you'll just naturally trigger that every turn. Yeah, it's a weird one. The upgrade on this one, making it X+1, is a pretty significant improvement, but more so my problem with this card is just that what it does is not something I really care to do very often, so making it better at doing that thing I don't really care about, not really going to change my opinion of the card very much. Again, maybe this is a little contentious to some, but I'm not a big fan of Dedication. Next, we have Divine Spark. Divine Spark is great. It's an A-tier card. Being able to... So as we mentioned earlier, Tempest, she doesn't have a ton of drawing and discarding type effects. It's not super easy for her to dig through the deck as quickly as a lot of the other characters can. This is a really good way to solve that problem. Just grab whatever card you want straight out of the deck. It can't get X costs, and it has to be a heavy card unless you upgrade it. Then it just can't be a buff for an X cost. So this will fetch you utility options like quick charges and stuff. This will fetch you your shock appliers. This will fetch you, you know, some big chunky hit like a conduit or something that we were just talking about. It gets you basically anything you need. Obviously, not being able to get buffs is not really a huge deal. It just kind of means you can't like greenstone this and use it to set up your some sort of like Blackstone grounded or something like that. That'd be kind of crazy. But there's other ways to handle the buffs, so you know, don't worry about that. Just think about this as utility in the middle of a fight. A blind shock to all enemies equal to the cost of the card you grab is also pretty good. Because a lot of the time you do want to grab a really expensive, high-impact card, right? You're going to grab your 3 or 4 cost block card. You're going to grab your 2, 3, or 4 cost attack. And so that's a pretty good amount of shock you're spreading out, basically for free. It does really want an upgrade most of the time, I think. But really good card. Really good card once you've done that. It works on an axis that Tempest really appreciates. Next, we've got Errantry. Errantry, another weird uncommon X cost, man. I have a strange relationship with the Tempest uncommon X costs. This one I'm willing to give a B to. Getting some rage and delay rage the next X turns, and 2 Zeal on top of that. This is pretty respectable, I would say. Upgrade on this one, getting X+1 turns. quite nice. The fact that the rage is split up like this makes it less likely that you're wasting any of that rage if you have a turn where you're needing to block a bunch. It makes it... It's got this funky thing going on. So, like, you play this thing, next turn you've got 25. The turn after that you'll have 50 if you've played it for that many turns, because the rage and the delay rage are lining up now. So there's this sweet spot in the middle, 2 turns from when you play it, where you get to deal extra damage. So it's not the easiest thing to use that to, like, set up a big kill turn. You know, planning 1 turn in advance is not that hard. Planning 2 turns in advance is pretty tricky. Not very easy to predict what you will or won't be drawing by then. But, you know, it's just decent value. 2 zeal every turn is pretty handy. Yeah, it's not exactly knocking your socks off, but it's pretty okay. Next up, we've got Great Lunge. Great Lunge is pretty comparable to Conduit, but I'm going to give this one a B tier. Basically, it deals a decent bit more damage. 35 is a lot. But instead of having just strictly upsides, it's got this downside. Next card played costs 1 more. And then another upside that can sort of mitigate the downside, right? If you gain 1 energy, that gets rid of the tempo cost. And you're drawing a card on top of it, which is pretty good. But in any situation where you're not getting the Slay effect, 4 effective energy spent to deal 35 is not a great deal, right? Because the big draw this has up front over the Conduit is just that it hits harder. But when you factor in, well, if I'm actually paying more for it, it's actually a worse deal in terms of damage dealt. If you upgrade it, 40 damage base, like, that's a big number, you know, to just have printed unmodified on a card, 40 damage. The Slay effect gets even better, and of course it's just that much easier to trigger it at 40. This can be a way to really mop up multi-enemy fight. You kill 1 guy, you get extra cards, you get extra energy, you use that to kill another guy. It's a good way to hit 100% battle progress. But it's not as useful out of the box as a card like Conduit is. It does require a bit of setup. Maybe you need to upgrade it. Maybe you need to whittle down the enemy's health a bit first to get the Slay effect. It definitely asks more of you than Conduit or even Rebuke, where those are just simple, hey, I deal a lot of damage. This one's like, yeah, I deal a lot of damage, but I can also mess up your energy economy quite a bit if you don't, you know, pay attention to the exact health thresholds and draw orders and stuff. But it's still pretty reasonable, so harder to use, higher upside, I'd say it's a B tier. Well, I mean, it's not even truly fair to say it's a higher upside per se. You might actually prefer that -3 cost on the next cards from Conduit, but it's still a good upside. Anyway, let's move on. Now we have at You. This is an awful lot of rage. B tier card, I'd say. 1 energy for 75% rage and expel is good filler, if nothing else. That is not a bad card for almost any deck to play. Helps you set up a big kill turn. Potentially having the extra 50% rage if you have Zeal is pretty good, but oftentimes you would be wanting to use this and then immediately play your big attacks, and that means that you're not going to have very much Zeal when you play it, so it's actually kind of tricky to get that rage 50%. If you upgrade it, it's a little bit easier. You know, maybe you draw into this off of a quick charge or something, and boom, there you go, the Zeal 3. But it's still a little more awkward than you would like. Especially because if you're playing those other cards to hit the Zeal threshold, that means you have less energy to spend on something like an X-cost card. And so you might end up actually dealing less damage overall if you try to meet that Zeal conditional. So it can be a little awkward, but Even at its worst, this card's still pretty good, and that's a textbook B tier card if you ask me. Next, we have Hold Firm. I love Hold Firm. A tier card for me. This is a very flexible block. Really, really nice. 1 mana for 11 is really good at base value, right? But then, of course, next card played costs 1 more. That's not super great. However, it has this really phenomenal extra trigger effect. It only goes off if you still have more to block, and then it gives you the extra block you need. It does double stack the tempo, but there are plenty of ways to handle that. There's ways to take advantage of it with stuff like your contra positions. That's an excellent 2-card combo right there. This is a really good stone carrier because of the extra triggers. Putting a yellow stone in this thing, it is a house of a block card that only costs you 1 energy to play up front. So kind of like how I was talking about, I like Clashing Steel to put a yellow stone in that. This is like a much more extreme version of that. You can end your turn by spending 1 energy, and you're getting 22 block base plus maybe 8 more. You could be getting up to 30 block if you put a yellow stone in this thing for 1 energy. That's ridiculous. That's so good. You gotta deal with the tempo eventually, of course, but it can really buy you time. It can help with those enemies that alternate between big damage and small damage turns. It is just a phenomenal block. Easy A tier. Next, we have Imbue Weapon. This is a fun card. I'm going to put it in B tier. How much use you can get out of this in the early game, it's not really much of a question. You just need a little bit of overcharge, and you'll be dealing a pretty reasonable amount of damage with this guy. Since you can just gain the overcharge on the turn that you want to hit with this thing, you can use your... if you have the spell that generates overcharge, you can just use that and then, throw out the Imbue Weapon. You can hold this, or you can hold a card that gains overcharge when you know that this is coming up in the draw pile to ensure that it works out that way. If you have Zeals that are giving you overcharge, that's quite good. It hits reasonably hard early on, and then by the late game, when you might have a whole lot of overcharge, it hits very hard. It's a heavy card, which is good. The upgrade on it, improving that base damage, makes it very nice in the early game. 2 for 16 is pretty respectable, even just at face value on a heavy attack early on. I can't say I've ever had a run that really centralized around this card, even though it kind of seems like it might be something you could do that with. Doesn't usually end up working out that way. But it will almost always be a pretty decent damage dealer if you have access to overcharge, so B tier. Next up we have Inner Oasis. This one is absolutely an A tier, and I almost put this thing in S tier, although that's almost certainly personal bias of my own, because this is maybe my favorite card in the game. It's so good. Block 3, draw 2. As we were mentioning, Tempest doesn't have a ton of deck cycling. This is really good way to draw through your deck, just 2 draw on a 2-cost card, so you're breaking even in terms of resources while digging deeper for whatever pieces you need. You're getting some block out of the mix. If you upgrade it, you're actually getting quite a bit of block, and it doesn't even have the block tag, so you can use it to cheese some of the guys that care about you playing block cards. It's a pretty good Blackstone target. At that point, you're generating an awful lot of Zeal for very minimal resource investment, and getting a decent amount of block too. It is a very, very good card. Almost every deck can make room for this thing. Almost every deck. I was really tempted to say S tier on this one, but I don't think I can quite justify that. I have left it out of decks on occasion. Without the Blackstone, it's still pretty good. Not quite as meaningful. You could maybe upgrade it, put a Yellowstone on it. That's not too terrible. It's very flexible in its use cases. Great card one way or another. Next up, we have another really powerful uncommon, Invigoration. This one is also a pretty easy A tier, if you ask me. 0 energy, get a whole crap ton of rage. Basically, all of the negative things I had to say about Have At You don't apply to Invigoration at all. It does not cost any energy up front. It does not have any conditional stuff like with the Zeals. It just gives you a whole bunch of rage for 0 energy. Obviously, you do need to have Overcharge to make it work, but you almost always want to be able to stack up a decent amount of Overcharge anyway. The upgrade on this thing as well, Purging for Rage 25%, that's an excellent line of text to have on a Tempest card. So if you don't have a lot of Overcharge, you can still make really good use of this card. Just put an upgrade on it and purge it. It is potentially a good Blackstone target even. You can play it twice to have your Overcharge twice and get extra rage that way. So this one's really good to pair with the non-X cost finisher cards, since reducing that Overcharge can lower the threshold of your X cost card quite a bit. But being such a cheap way to generate so much rage, I mean, you're gonna find a way to make use of it, almost certainly. Very good card. Keep Pace. This one is also an A tier card. 1 for 6, not super good, but 50% rage and Purge Delay Rage 25. That is phenomenal. The Purge 25% on Invigoration that I was talking up so much, Delay Rage is a bit less good, but you don't have to upgrade it to get it. It's just there. Ridiculous. And if you ever get an upgrade point to put on this thing, Purge for 125% Delay Rage and Expel. Ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. This sets up kills very well when you want to purge it, and if you don't want to purge it, it's a pretty effective block card. 50% rage, not bad at all. It's a very good way to mix your offense and defense. Just an all-around excellent card. Even if you don't end up making use of the rage, purging a card to expel it is a pretty fascinating way to thin your deck out. So, can't possibly give this less than an A tier. Limit Break. This is perhaps the logical conclusion of the progression we've seen with cards like Rebuke, Conduit, and Great Lunge. It's 4 cost by default, which is crazy expensive, and it deals really big amounts of damage. I remember that since the cost contributes to the Zeal conditionals, if you just have a measly 3 Zeal before you play this thing, it instantly hits its own 7 conditional, 50% rage, going into effect before it deals the damage, so you're dealing 15 extra damage. It's pretty good. You hit the Zeal 10, add another 25% on top of that. That one's kind of tough to do, especially early on, but certainly not impossible. If you upgrade it, the numbers become even bigger. This is just the biggest, beatiest beat stick that you could ask for. It hits so freaking hard. If you can afford the energy that this thing requires, it's probably pretty dang good. It is a very respectable finisher. If you have really huge amounts of energy, you can play other attack cards after the fact, because, you know, the rage sticks around. It's not going anywhere. You could have 125% rage if you played an upgraded Limit Break just from that card itself. Throw out an extra 1 cost attack or something, and it's going to be hitting very, very hard. So, all of that in mind, I have to say that this one is going to be an A tier. It's just a ton of damage. Not the easiest finisher to work with, but the heights are very high on this one. Next up, we have Power Walk. Power Walk is also A tier. This is a much easier finisher to work with in general. Before we even talk about this card very much, I can just say pretty much straight out the gate, you kind of need to upgrade this thing. It's not very good unupgraded. The upgrade is very important. Discharging 2, pretty high cost. You're going to be doing it over and over again, of course, on this guy because he has Ghost. But the reduced cost of this card means that it is a really wonderful way to immediately turn your overcharge into pretty big damage. 25% rage every time you play it, so it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Just like I was talking about with Limit Break, all that rage doesn't go anywhere, so if you have extra stuff to play after you've power walked a bunch, it's going to hit pretty hard. It is a good middle ground between the X-cost finishers and the very expensive upfront damage cards like Limit Break, because it can be a bit more flexible. The fact that you can distribute the damage amongst multiple enemies is really good. So it's nice in multi-enemy fights for that purpose. It's just an all-around very flexible card, but again, you really do need to be upgrading it. If you find this thing and you can't upgrade it, you're going to be pretty sad, and you probably won't use it at all. If you find it early and you haven't had the chance to upgrade it yet, it's probably also going to underperform, but once you get that upgrade down, very good finisher. Next up, another excellent uncommon card, Raise Shields, easy A tier. I love this card. 6 block for 1 mana, not super great, but you recur a random block card, and that is super great. You can just immediately purge the card, get back the energy you spent on Raise Shields. Pretty good. You can use that card to get extra block, in case the 6 wasn't enough, because let's be honest, it probably wasn't. The upgrade on it boosted up to 10. Then it's actually quite respectable as a defensive option. Where this card really shines, though, is the Blackstone interaction. You put a Blackstone on this thing. The first time you play it, it goes to the graveyard, or the discard pile, and you get the volatile copy in hand. If you don't have any other block cards in your discard pile, or if you just get lucky, the volatile Raise Shields that you just got will give you back the original Raise Shields. At that point, maybe you purge another block card out of your hand, you play the original Raise Shields a second time, it's going to retrieve the card you just purged. It becomes a very energy-efficient way to gain a lot of block. If you have multiple copies of Raise Shields, maybe you put a Blackstone on one or even both of them, you can just go absolutely ham. You can play Raise Shields over and over and over again. You're getting so much block. You're being very efficient in terms of energy. It's not even that hard to manipulate the discard pile to set these things up. It is a very powerful card. Don't underestimate this one at all. Next up, Raw Power. Raw Power is never a card that you're happy to play. I'm going to give it C tier. This card is pretty much just a band-aid. When you don't have enough overcharge, Raw Power gives you a lot of overcharge. It doesn't do it in a very effective manner. It's not the easiest thing in the world to spend 3 energy on a card that deals no damage, gives you no block, draws you no cards. It's just overcharge. The Expel tag doesn't really matter that much because, I mean, you're never going to play this thing as filler, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a situation where you even wanted to play this thing twice in one combat. If you upgrade it so that it's rigged, then, like, it's a band-aidier band-aid to... I mean, it's just not good, man. It's just not good. It solves a problem in the short term before you can get a more comprehensive answer, but you do not want to be relying on Raw Power, right? Maybe it'll get you out of a tight spot early on, but you're just going to be looking for anything you possibly can to replace it. So I have to give it a C tier for that reason. Reaffirm is next, and this is such an interesting card. Very unique. We'll give it a B. Block equal to your current Zeal, setting Zeal to 0 and refreshing the powers. It's got a few different use cases. you can get you can get a pretty decent amount of block out of this thing, just from playing it. The ability to reset your Zeal powers if you have Zeal blocks, you can get extra block that way, right? Like maybe you just trigger your 3 and or 5, reset, and then trigger them again instead of going up to 7 or 10. That's an option. If you have a whole bunch of Zeal generation, then this can be a whole bunch of block, or it can be less wasted value. Instead of going up to, 25 Zeal and only triggering each Zeal power once, play this in the middle, and now you trigger all your Zeal powers twice. You're wasting a lot less value that way. Not bad. Still, it's definitely not something that fits into every deck. It's pretty awkward for some strategies to play with, but that's what the Purge effect is for when you upgrade it. You get +1 Zeal. That's a pretty reasonable Purge effect. And also the loop coming in on the upgrade is very interesting, right? Because that's not going to trigger if you're just purging it. So if you don't really care about the main effect, then you just purge it and that's all fine and dandy. If you do care about the main effect, the upgrade is still pretty good because you can just use this thing over and over and over, turn after turn. So maybe if you have a bunch of artifacts that are generating you Zeal, or you're playing like X costs that generate you Zeal every turn, the Reaffirm being able to loop is pretty interesting. It's probably better than some 1-cost card in your deck. You can probably make use of it one way or another. I think it's worth at least a B tier. Next up, Reroute. This one's a C tier. Finally, a Tempest power that isn't just really good. This one's fairly mediocre. It's like okay Zeal generation if you've got the discharge to support it, which you may or may not. Maybe you have relatively few discharge effects, but they're expensive, like your conduits and such. Maybe you have a bunch of discharge effects and you aren't actually able to keep up your overcharge in the first place to even trigger them. There's a number of ways that this thing kind of fails for you. At 2 cost, it's a lot less easy to get in play than a bunch of the other powers we've looked at so far. You can remedy that with the upgrade, but it's asking for more investment at that point. There's plenty of other cards you might have wanted to upgrade instead. Not the worst card in the world. I almost gave this a B tier, but all of that is maybe a little too theoretical, because when the rubber meets the road, I have not made use of this card very frequently. And I've got a lot of runs under my belt, so that's usually a good sign to me that the card is just not actually all that good. Next we have Say Your Prayers, Hope's counterpart. Instead of just pure draw, you draw and discard. This guy is going to be a B tier. It's interesting. So week X, I was kind of talking down on Languish earlier, being week 2. This one's a little bit better, right? If you just want to play it for 1 energy, 1 turn of weak is, you can always use that in a situation where it's relevant. You just use it on the enemy that's attacking, and there you go. You got value out of it. And then it's like a little mini battle plan type effect stapled on there as well. You play it for 1, you draw 2, you discard 1, you got some value out of the week maybe. That's an okay card. You can play it for 3. Getting 3 turns of week is quite a bit better than getting 2 turns of week, because there are not very many enemies that will not attack you at least 2 times in 3 turns. Some enemies will attack you 3 times in 3 turns. So it's a lot easier to get more value out of the week in that regard. The draw and discard, the fact that you are discarding does help you deal with status cards too, so that's nice. And should you upgrade this thing, suddenly, out of nowhere, boom, 2 vulnerable. Where did that come from? That's pretty good. That is pretty good. You can play this thing for 0, don't forget. You can play X costs for 0. This vulnerable does not care about how much energy you spend. It doesn't have an X anywhere in it, so 0 energy for 2 vulnerables, not bad. Not bad at all. Of course, actually emptying your energy in order to take advantage of that is easier said than done, but, it's there. It is there as an option. You could do something interesting like play a Hope first to dump all your energy, throw this out to get the Vulnerable for 0, and then you can purge cards to feed whatever your finisher is. It's got a lot of neat little tricks you can do with it. You know, it's good for any kind of synergy that cares about X cost cards that you might have. Not a bad card at all. Not a bad card at all, although that upgrade does carry a lot of weight. So, if you're gonna try to make use of this thing, it would be really good to be able to put an upgrade on it, I'll say. But even without the upgrade, it's okay. Next up, we've got Shock and Block. This guy is, I guess, a B tier. A little hesitant. I almost wanted to put it in C tier. It's another one of those cards, like several that we've mentioned so far. It does two things. It does both of them somewhat okay-ish, right? Like, this is not a phenomenal source of shock. 3 energy for 11 shock, not a good deal. This is not an excellent source of block either, 3 for 11. You really need to be getting particular value out of both of those effects together in order for this card to make any sense at all. And it's not at all a crazy ask to, you know, be able to take advantage of both of those. But it is awkward at times, you know, spending 3 energy for that small of an amount of block. It can be weird trying to weave that in, you know, like, do you really want to be using this card to set up shock and getting a little bit of defense when you could instead be using a smaller block card for an equivalent amount of block, and then you've got more energy to spend on, you know, stuff like buffs, because, you know, Tempest has plenty of decent buffs. I don't know. It's a tough one. It's a tough one. I think it's good enough to warrant a B tier, but it's a little tenuous. It's like a B minus. Moving on, we've got Splitting Arcs. What a redemption story this card has had, in my opinion, at the very least. A tier. Before this thing got buffed and it was only for overcharge gained, I did not like this card very much. But oh boy, this is a ton of damage these days. Especially if you upgrade it. Especially if you have multiples or you're blackstoning it or something as a 0-coster. Very easy to just slap a blackstone in this, drop it down twice, play your purple charge, your purple stone, quick charge, and you just dealt a ton of damage, right? You gained 2 overcharge from playing the quick charge, then 1 from the purple stone. You play it a second time off the rebound, 4 separate instances of gaining overcharge. If you had a Blackstone Splitting Arcs, that is 40 damage to all enemies for 4 energy, and you've drawn 2 cards. That's absurd. That's so good. That's obviously a very specific example. I'm talking about 2 upgraded cards with specific colored stones in them. But, like, purple Quick Charge, first off, is, like, one of the most staple go-tos in Tempest anyway. So that's not exactly crazy to imagine. Really, all we're talking about is, do you want to commit a Blackstone and upgrade to the Splitting Arcs, if you have such a thing? Especially because you can pick the Quick Charge off a Mastery, and it's often the right thing to pick. You could put that combo together way more often than you might expect, and oh boy, is it a lot of damage. For such a small investment of energy on the turn you're doing that, you're off to a great start. Any other cards you have that are discharging or gaining energy, any Zeal effects that are discharging or gaining overcharge, it only goes up, you know? It only goes up. This thing is a serious damage dealer. Don't underestimate it just because, you know, 3 or 5 seem like relatively small numbers. Once you actually start playing with this thing, very impressive. Next up, Surge. Surge is almost certainly my least favorite X-cost finisher for Tempest, but I'll still put it in B tier. the fact that you have to discharge each time you want to deal damage, it's not ideal, you know. Like, obviously we were pretty positive on Power Walk earlier, but Power Walk didn't require you to do everything all at once, right? Like, you could play it exactly as many times as you wanted. You could weave it in between other cards. You could split the damage up as you wished. You were gaining rage each time. Surge doesn't have any of that stuff going for it. You know, you got to target one guy, dump it all on him. Your overcharge is gone immediately at that point. But it is pretty good damage, right? And the fact that it's getting extra triggers is, you know, it's pretty nice. You can, of course, upgrade it to make the damage feel better. 13 damage per per energy that you dump into this thing. That's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, it's not bad. It's not, but it's you have to play into its intricacies a bit more than you do with the other X-Cost finishers. So I will still give it a B tier, but I'm not the biggest fan of it. I would generally prefer the other X-Costs. Next up, we've got Thunderstorm. This is such an interesting buff. We're going to put it in B tier. This can be a pretty reasonable way to ensure that you get down quite a bit of shock throughout a fight. Just put a greenstone on this thing, purge a bunch of cards, and throw this down turn 1. I've done that more than a handful of times, and it's not bad at all. If you upgrade it, getting some shock immediately is pretty nice. If the fight is only going to last like 4-ish turns, which is generally what you want to aim for, this is a very impactful upgrade. It's decent filler if you aren't going all in on this thing or using it as a real solution to your shock needs. You don't really mind playing this at most values of X. Again, since it's an X cost, you can play it at 0, and it will still do something. It's one shock to every enemy each turn for 0. That's not great, but, you know, I mean, that's okay as far as filler goes. Not a bad card. Not a bad card. Next, we are finally at the rares. Or, no, we're not quite at the rares yet. We're almost there. Next is Turbulence. Turbulence is going to be a B tier. It's pretty okay. 1 energy for 6 shock is it's okay. It's not that bad. Dealing damage equal to half the target's shock to all enemies is very good. That's a great effect. It is not an attack card itself, so it does not benefit from shock, nor does it trigger shock. So this is a reasonable way to set the stage. There's a lot of fights where there are multiple enemies. One of them has a significant amount of health. The other ones are squishy. And in those cases, you want to stack as much shock as you can on the healthy guy, right? And then you want to hit him with some big finishing attack. He's going to die, and now you have to pick off the weenies. And that can be a bit annoying, but if you're stacking up a bunch of shock, Turbulence all of a sudden is just going to wipe those guys out very efficiently. It's really nice with the Zeal effects and such that apply shock to the highest health enemy. The fact that it doesn't disrupt the buildup of shock on that one main target is good. And this purge effect is also quite good because it helps you do the exact same thing for when you aren't able to purge this, when you aren't able to play it, when you don't have the energy to fit this into your turn. You just purge it. It's putting the shock on the highest HP enemy. That's exactly the kind of thing that we want to be doing with our Turbulence. The upgrade on it, 8 shock, that's pretty good. 5 shock on Purge, that's a little ridiculous. Very, very nice Purge effect, especially in a single target fight. it is a great way to make use of this card in a single target fight when that AoE value is reduced. It does still, of course, hit the main target itself. That is not to be discounted. That's going to be quite a bit of damage. It's a good card. It's a very good card. One of the better uncommon shock cards. Next we have Vanguard. The last uncommon. This one was pretty dang bad before it got buffed. And I gotta say, after the buff, it is still pretty dang bad, unfortunately. C tier card. It's just very awkward to make use of. 2 for 20 is pretty decent. You know, Imbue Weapon at 2 for 16 on the upgrade I said was okay, right? But if you have even just 2 overcharge, which is not that much, Imbue Weapon is already tied for Vanguard, and every point of overcharge you have above it is gonna push it further and further beyond. I mean, an upgraded Vanguard deals 22, so if we're comparing apples to apples, they're both upgraded. You need 3 overcharge to break even. Again, not a very big ask. And since the upside on Imbue Weapon is just that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more overcharge you have, what's the upside on Vanguard? Well, nothing most of the time. But if you want to give up 5 overcharge, if you even have 5 overcharge, to delay rage 150%, this is just such an awkward effect, right? Like, if you don't have 5 overcharge, it doesn't do anything at all after it deals its damage, which is pretty underwhelming. If you do have 5 overcharge, there's a decent chance you don't want to get rid of all of it for rage. What if you need to block next turn? What if you need to play your setup cards or something, right? Too bad, your overcharge is gone. You know, you're getting a bunch of delay rage. What if you're only drawing buffs and blocks and such next turn? Well, now you've lost all this overcharge and you aren't even getting any benefit at all. If you upgrade it, it doesn't really change anything. You know, -1 discharge, it's nice that it goes down, but 4 is still a big ask. 175% rage now. I mean, more rage is good, but it's only 25% more, and all those situations where you can't really make use of the rage they're just as bad. I mean, as a discharge 5, obviously it's good with like the bulging capacitor, but more often than not, this card is just bad. Sorry, Vanguard. And now we actually move on to the rares for real. Starting out with Bolt. Whoops, not Blot. What is wrong with me? There we go. Starting out with Bolt. Bolt is a great card. It's an A tier card. 11 damage for 2 energy is pretty bad, but discharge 4 to draw 2 is really good. You know, I was saying that Grease Lightning was good at discharge 5 to draw 1. You know, this is smaller discharge, bigger draw. That's pretty good, especially if you play this thing as an opener. Being able to discharge 8 to draw 4 cards, that's so many cards. Really powerful, and of course you're dealing 22 damage at that point, which is actually quite a bit of damage for a card that only cost you 2 energy and drew you 4. Ridiculous. The one sticking point on Bolt, though, is because it's an opener effect, you can't, similar to Electric Kite, you can't play cards to gain the overcharge you might need before you play the Bolt. That being said, Bolt is a rare. You're probably finding this later in the run, and at that point, you know, you've got purgeable cards that give you overcharge. Maybe you've got artifacts that are giving you overcharge. You have potentially your spell that's giving you overcharge. So there's a few ways you can try and sneak in that extra overcharge. Most of the time, though, you will still be pretty unhappy when you draw this in your opening hand, because you're not going to be drawing cards at all from it. But in the middle of a fight, after you've had some time to build up overcharge, this thing is just a slam dunk. It's so good. The upgrade on it, reducing that discharge cost, is also a huge deal. Needing 8 overcharge total to get maximum draw versus just 6. That's a really, really nice upgrade. And the damage is nothing to sneeze at either. Now you're dealing 28 damage when you get the trigger +1. And don't forget, even if you don't have the overcharge to trigger the discharge once or twice, you are still getting the trigger for extra damage, right? If you have no overcharge, you can still just play this as your opener, and it's 2 mana, deal 22, or, yeah, upgraded 2 mana, deal 28. That's not half bad. You know, if you're discharging only once, you're getting 2 draw, but the extra damage always comes in. It's just a really good card. It is just a really good card. Pretty easy to slot this thing into just about any deck, unless you really need your overcharge for something else. That's the reason it's not S tier. It is very hungry. It's going to chew through your overcharge like nobody's business. All that extra card draw is just going to cycle you back around to the bolt that much faster, which means that you're probably going to play it again, and you're probably going to lose even more overcharge. So A tier for that reason alone. It does sort of monopolize your overcharge unless you're really, really pumping that stuff out. But otherwise, it would be S. It's a very good card. Next up, we have Cadence. This is an interesting one. I'm going to give it a B tier. It's another... Well, it's basically an energy generator. Right? It doesn't actually give you energy. It makes the next card cost 1 less. So that's better than energy because it can interact with tempo synergies. But it's worse than energy because you're not able to spend that energy and therefore earn zeal. Right? Playing a 1 cost that's been reduced to 0 is worth no zeal. Whereas if you just got an energy, you'd be able to gain zeal off of it. Nevertheless, it's not too crazy hard to get value out of this thing. You know, Tempest has plenty of expensive cards, and it's a lot better than Aftershock, because Aftershock only works with X costs. Cadence works with all of your X costs, because you can just choose to pay 3. But then it also works with everything else that is more expensive, and it also can work with itself. You know, you could, if you have a lot of energy, and probably have to put an upgrade on this thing too, you put a Blackstone in this, and now you can double stack it, and it's going to trigger itself, and every time you pay a card that's 3 or more now, you get -2, which is pretty nutty. -2 tempo, just constantly throughout a fight getting that effect over and over and over again. That's very quickly going to start paying for the cadence. So, pretty cool, pretty cool. Nevertheless, you won't always have that many expensive cards. And in those situations, this thing isn't very good. If you can't afford the upgrade on it, it's a lot harder to really go off with this thing. I mean, 4 is just so much. Remember when this card used to cost 5? Jeez. It's situational applications based on the kind of deck you're going for are enough to keep it out of A tier in my books. But when the time is right, it is still kind of crazy. Next up, we've got Chonk. Chonk is here. Let's pull up all 3 pieces at once there. Chonk used to be probably the easiest S tier in the game, maybe, but since it's been toned down a little bit, I really debated heavily on this one if I should make it A or S. I'm honestly still not totally sure. I think I am gonna put it in S though. I mean, Bonk, of course, the star of the show, the final card in the line. 1 vulnerable and 45 damage is ridiculous if you've upgraded the Chonk such that the entire chain of cards is upgraded. 3 vulnerable and 55 damage. That's ridiculous. That it's such a heavy hitter. It just kills everything. Let's hide the S so you can actually read the other card here. Stronk, I mean, 12 shock and 75 delay rage is ridiculous. Obviously, you want to time it such that Stronk happens the turn before Bonk, and that's not very hard to do because you can just, you know, filter through your deck beforehand. You can hold this card if need be. It's pretty easy to put the Bonk in deck when there are going to be 5 cards or fewer to guarantee you draw this next turn. So very easy to set up. The Chonk giving 15 delay block 2 is really nice because it makes it easy to play the Stronk on the next turn. And the upgrade on the Stronk giving you even more rage and shock. I mean, it's just all the cards work together so well. It's really easy to play the strategy behind them. It's not difficult to execute it. It fits into basically any deck. In fact, it just kind of takes over the deck. Just sort of parasitizes it. Whatever you were doing before, you find the chonk. You're a chonk deck now. So, yeah, it's an S tier card. What can I say? Anyway, the next card we're going to talk about is Cloudburst. Cloudburst is A tier. Cloudburst is a pretty cool card. It's very expensive, but 20 damage to everyone is a huge hit. Huge damage on that. Especially if you've upgraded it, getting up to 26 damage to everybody, and removing all Fortitude, which is probably worth some extra damage. Not bad. Discharge 2 is not that much to ask for a really big upside rebound. More so than any other card in the game, I think Cloudburst benefits from the unique ability of rebound cards to play them and also then keep the rebounded card for next turn. You can play this card every turn just over and over and over again, which you shouldn't need to be playing it that many turns in a row because you play this thing 2 or 3 turns in a row and it's probably killed everything with some shock, rage, or just additional damage from other cards. It hits quite hard, and if need be, you can always just purge that rebounded card to get some extra energy. Maybe you needed some block, maybe you want to finish off with a different card because this Cloudburst killed off the smaller guys, and now you want to use the extra energy from purging this thing to kill off the bigger, high-health guy. Pretty flexible card, pretty useful, high damage dealer. I like it. A tier. Next, we've got Devotion. Devotion, I'm going to put also in B tier. It's a little weird. It generates quite a bit of zeal, but, you know, it doesn't let you purge X-cost cards to trigger it, and X-cost cards get purged more often than regular cards, just due to their all-or-nothing nature, I would say. So that does actually hurt it quite a bit. And, you know, plenty of cards that have purge effects are cheap as well, right? Not to mention stuff like Divine Intervention as well, the X-cost common block having a purge zeal, that's like kind of awkward. You know, your Thwarts as 1 cost with a purge effect is awkward. Invigoration is a 0 cost with a purge effect is awkward. There's several 1-cost cards with purge effects that we looked over previously too, like Shift Polarity and stuff. It's just kind of tough to set things up in a way that you can very easily get all that much zeal out of this thing. It'll generate some zeal for you, no doubt, but somewhat frequently, it isn't going to be that much zeal. And, I mean, you know, this is a rare card, right? Like, it should be doing quite a bit. Maybe you don't even need the zeal, right? Maybe you already have good zeal generation. Zeal only needs to go up to 10 before it's just all being wasted. Unless you have Reaffirm or something, so I have to say, not the biggest fan of Devotion. But it's really cheap at a 1 cost. You know, it's an Expel, so it's not that hard to just put this in as some filler, throw it out there, weave it in between, you know, whatever else your deck is doing, and it'll give you some value probably. So that's worth at least a B tier. Next we have Divine Retribution. This card is ridiculous. This is an S tier card. It is so much rage. 50 rage X times. And, you know, you get some damage for free, too. It's 1 damage, which is hilarious. But, you know, it's something. And if you upgrade it, you're getting 4 damage. That's a real amount of damage. It happens after the rage, so it'll be pretty respectable. But obviously, you just want to play this mostly as a huge rage generator. And then you play literally anything else, and it is going to clobber whoever you are fighting. So much damage. This is the win condition of so many of my runs. It's not quite as, like, centralizing as Chonk, I guess, but it very often does feel like you find Divine Retribution, and it's like, okay, this is what we're doing. This is the thing that my deck wants to do now. So I couldn't give it anything less than an S tier. Next up, we have Eye of the Storm. Eye of the Storm is an A tier card. Just simply put, it says Purge Overcharge 1 on it, unupgraded, and that's pretty dang good. It's a great Purge effect, and if you do ever happen to get all the way up to 15 Overcharge, which is certainly not the craziest thing in a late game deck, being able to make a card trigger +2 or +3 extra times is kind of nutty. You know, just imagine you go Eye of the Storm and then Limit Break or something, right? Crazy, crazy, crazy damage output. You're not going to use that discharge effect super often, obviously. It's pretty much once per fight maximum, even if you have a really crazy overcharge build. And it's not always going to line up where you have this plus the card you want to trigger a bunch. Kind of awkward, but, you know, this Purge effect does a lot of heavy lifting with this card. Hard to say no to something like that. Next up, we have Helmbreaker. Definitely a card that is worthy of the namesake. This is an A tier card. It is vulnerable, which Tempest cares about a lot. It deals a whole bunch of damage just at base value. The fact that it's dealing damage multiple times means that it benefits from the shock a lot, which you want to be putting on the enemy. It has really good synergy with plus tempo, getting extra triggers, 2 extra damage triggers per tempo you have, 14 extra damage base. This thing executes people. It's really good. Pretty simple, straightforward card. You can't really like lean in super hard on it, short of just, you know, playing your plus tempo cards. But you don't have to lean in super hard on it because even at base value, it's just good. It is just good. Next we have Honor and Glory. Honor and Glory is a pretty good A tier card. It does a lot of stuff. The upgrade on this one's pretty crucial, I will say, to make it better value. 3 cost, bit of a big ask. 2 cost is a really good deal, actually. This is a huge impact, dropping it from 3 to 2. But you get a good amount of block, you get a little bit of rage, overcharge, zeal, and 1 vulnerable to everybody. That's just like, no matter what's going on, at least 2, probably 3, maybe all of these effects are going to be pretty relevant, right? Like, maybe you don't need the block, but then guess what? Rage, overcharge, zeal, and vulnerable is looking pretty good. Maybe you're not playing a bunch of attacks, so the vulnerable and the rage aren't good, but you're getting block, overcharge, zeal. It's just great. It's a great card. It does everything, it feels like, you know? You would be extremely hard-pressed to find a turn when this card is not good, unless you just can't even spare the 2 energy to play it. If you can't upgrade this thing, like maybe you get it from a card pack with a rare in the final Well of Stars or something, then it's a lot dicier. But even then, it's still pretty okay. So, has to be A tier. Next up, Omniscience. This is a very strange card. I'm going to give it B tier. If I remember correctly, this is the only card in the entire game that just has rigged printed on it. It does not need an upgrade. It doesn't need, you don't stone it or anything. It's just rigged. Pretty strange. It lets you grab any ability or buff from your deck, and then it has this funky ghost effect. So what's nice about this card, of course, is it lets you put a different stone on a buff. So almost always that's going to mean you get to put a black stone on a buff, and then instead of needing to rig it to make sure you get it in play turn 1, the Omniscience is just there for you. You pay 1 energy to get that card to your hand, and now you get to double play it, and that's really good. You even get the Ghosted Omniscience some of the time to get extra buffs. You can use the Omniscience to get yourself a card that you can then... Like, you play this, you get the Ghosted card. Maybe the card you grabbed off Omniscience lets you discard the Ghosted copy of it. Maybe it has a blue stone in it or something. Maybe it's a... Say Your Prayers or something, whatever. You can get some extra value out of it that way. It is a little weird sometimes trying to get 3 overcharge to pay for this. Being able to only pay 2 on upgrade is pretty good. You know, if you have, like we were talking about, she has so many 1-cost buffs that you might want to get in play. So this can help out there. The reason I have to give it B tier because it is a little situational. By the time you find this card, you may well have already slotted greenstones into those buffs. You may well have already slotted your blackstones elsewhere, and so those aren't still around to make use of with the Omniscience. Yeah, you really might not need this effect. Not necessarily. If you do need it, though, you'll be pretty happy. But for that reason, it has to be a B tier. Next, we have Open the Heavens. And this one is going to be an A tier. Trigger all your Zeal powers. All the other Zeal power related stuff we've been talking about, it's been a little hard to evaluate because what Zeals you have matters so much. Not so much with Open the Heavens. You presumably have at least some Zeals, you know, you've probably taken a few fights with Fervor, and this is just going to make stuff happen. It's kind of like Honor and Glory. You're going to get a variety of random effects triggering off. You know, you might be applying Shock, gaining Overcharge, getting Block, getting Rage. All sorts of stuff are going to be happening. It's almost certain that at least a couple of those effects are pretty good, pretty much regardless of the situation. Not to mention, Open the Heavens being an expensive card, 4 cost or 3 upgraded, is giving you quite a bit of Zeal on its own when you play it. So you play, you know, a handful of other cards, and you'll have triggered every Zeal power twice on the turn that you use Open the Heavens. And that's probably pretty dang good, you know? You'd be hard-pressed to find a scenario where that was not a very useful thing to have done. It can be kind of pricey. That's really the only downside about this thing, you know? Even upgraded 3 energy, that's a lot. That's a lot to ask. But usually well worth it. Usually. You know, maybe you had a weird run and you don't have a 10 unlocked or something, then this card's not very good. But most of the time, you'll have 4 Zeal powers available to you, and you'll like this card. Next, we have Overload. Overload's really good. Overload is an A tier card. Each time you gain Overcharge, that much shock to the highest enemy, that's not bad, man. Upgrade it, twice that much shock, that's really good. That is a heck of a lot of shock. You're going to be gaining Overcharge, right? Like, it's going to happen sooner or later. This is another one of those cards that with Purple Quickstone Syndrome, where it's like, if you have, or Purple Quick Charge, if you have the Purple Stone Quick Charge, you're going crazy immediately with this thing. But even without it, it's still pretty good. A lot of Tempest cards and relics and Zeal powers and stuff, a lot of them say Overcharge. You will trigger this thing. You can Blackstone this thing. If you've Blackstoned it and upgraded it, you're getting 4 times the amount of shock dealt out. Any sort of big Overcharge gainer, something that's gaining you a lot at once, you know, 3 or more, is going to go absolutely crazy, this thing. Really good card. Really good card. The downside with this thing is that because it has that highest HP restriction, there are some crucial fights where it's awkward. So versus the Void, of course, it does nothing to help you kill the minions, and sometimes you really want to rush down the minions. Again, Tempest, lacking the ability to filter through her deck easily, can get bogged down pretty heavily with the Afflictions. There's some dangerous fights like Archaeos and the Golem, the Vault Guardian, whatever that guy's name is, the Obsidian Golem. In those fights, you know, it's all good at first. It's putting the shock on the guy you care about, but once you start to damage him down, suddenly, you know, if Archaeos' limbs or the Golem's hands have more health than the main guy himself, uh-oh, your Overload's been turned off. That's really, really bad. But those fights are relatively few and far between, and you can still play around that to an extent. So definitely not enough to drop Overload into B tier, but you do need to be a little careful. It's not a no-brainer. It's not an S tier card, but it is very, very strong. So definitely an A tier. Resonate. Resonate is also an A tier. This is basically the counterpart to Helmbreaker. You're getting Rage, you're getting Shock, and you're triggering extra times based on the card's cost, so another really excellent way to make use of plus tempo. This thing can generate a whole heck of a lot of Rage, a whole heck of a lot of Shock. The next turn, after you've played this, you have all that Rage, the Shock is there, it's very easy to get kills. You upgrade this thing, and it's not even inert, so you could put a purple stone or something on it, get a whole bunch of extra energy next turn. You could put a yellow stone on it, now it's setting up offense and its immediate defense. Plenty of ways to use this card. It's pretty dang good. You'll rarely be disappointed to find this thing. Next is Retaliate. Retaliate is... it's pretty good. It's an A tier. It only deals 1 less damage than Smite, and you're getting 4 block per energy spent on it. That is a really, really good deal. You upgrade this thing, it's dealing a pretty respectable amount of damage too, 7 per, and you're getting 5 block. Most of the time, this is going to be something you use as a block card, but the damage will be far from irrelevant. It can definitely kill lower health enemies. It is a really great way to handle enemies that don't let up. So the Void, obviously, something like a Beast of Malice, where it's just damage, damage, damage. Retaliate is a great way to make sure that you keep the pace of the fight going forward, you're whittling them away, and you're not having to worry about all of the damage they're throwing at you nearly as much as you would normally. Excellent combination of effects here. This is like the opposite of those cards that I kept talking about where, like, Shock and Block, it does 2 things, and it's mediocre at both of these. This does 2 things, and it's pretty decent at both of them. So... even if you aren't getting block, for example, you know, if you've upgraded this thing 7 damage per, that's okay. If you don't really need to deal that much damage and you're overkilling, you know, a small guy by a bunch or something, but you just want the block, it's pretty okay. Great card. Almost done here. The penultimate card is Stalwart. Unfortunately, I do have to give this one a C tier. The first time, each turn you play a heavy block equal to twice its cost. Oh yeah, this is the other card. There are 2, in fact, that say Rig just at base, which is kind of interesting. That they're both Tempest rares. I don't know what to make of that, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, even if you upgrade this thing, get it down to 1, right? Like, are you even playing a heavy card every turn? A lot of the time, the answer is no. A lot of times when you are playing your heavy cards, you're killing things, right? If it's a single target fight and you're killing them with your limit break or whatever other, you know, huge X cost you have or something, you don't need block. It's awkward with some of the cheaper heavy cards, stuff like Yin Yang, right? It's like you're gaining 4 block if you play a Yin Yang. You spent 2 energy on this thing if you didn't have it upgraded, right? Like, you probably want to get more than 4 block every now and then, right? It's just a little too awkward. If you have a lot of heavy cards, they're probably not all expensive, so that means that even if you're triggering this thing a lot, you're triggering it for smaller values. If you don't have that many heavy cards, it's inconsistent. You know, at the very least, it's giving you block on a turn when you're spending a bunch of your energy probably on damage if you have expensive heavy cards. So that has a lot of the benefit of what I was praising Retaliate for. But Retaliate is, you know, everything packed together in a nice, neat bundle for you. Stalwart asks you to play this card and then draw the heavy card on the turn when you need the block. And even then, it's only giving you, you know, so much block. It's not scalable in the way that Retaliate is. So, sorry, Stalwart, you're a C. But we do still get to end on a high note. The last Tempest card is Tapped Out, and Tapped Out is definitely an A-tier card. This one is pretty good. Deals damage based on your missing energy to everybody for just 1 energy. And if you upgrade it, it even overcharges you first. Overcharge is pretty good in its own right. Now you're actually increasing your max energy right before you use this thing as well, so you have even more missing energy. This thing can hit very, very hard. It's great at taking advantage of decks that have a whole bunch of overcharge. You can spend a bunch of energy on an X cost card, and you have 1 other card left in hand that you can purge, get up to 1 energy, throw out the tapped out, and just add a pretty big extra boost of damage to the end of your turn here. You can put a Blackstone in this thing and double play it at the end of a turn to deal quite a bit of extra damage. It's just a very nice a very nice card to deal with hallway fights, a great way to kill minions, and even against single targets, this thing can do pretty respectable damage depending on how much overcharge you have, so it's quite good. And that is gonna do it for our Tempest tier list. We did all 97 cards. Hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more Vault content. Make sure to check out my hidden tier list. Next up, we will be doing Enlightened. And, of course, we'll go and do Relics and such as well in coming days. I will see you guys all next time. Peace out.